Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining the Will Work for Food New Possibilities Hour. Today is April 21st, 2022. Will Work for Food was started 2 years ago, just more than 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic and lockdowns, in an effort to not only help our industry, the resolution industry, but also to help raise awareness and money for food banks. Food insecurity is an international issue, and we're in a unique position to donate to food banks. So we hope that you will find this program valuable and helpful and educational and thoughtful. And in return, if you can, donate any amount to either your local food bank or to the food bank that our presenters have chosen. And speaking of our presenters, let me do a quick introduction. Let's do ladies first with Carole Conn. Carole is the executive director of Project Sentinel, a housing nonprofit operating in Northern California and the Central Valley since 1971. The housing work of the agency includes support for any number of distresses and problems that renters face. Housing providers, homeowners, they all face different foreclosure issues, prevention to fair housing, all kinds of different issues. And Carole brings 30 years of experience in nonprofit work, project design, and innovative thinking to improving the lives of the most vulnerable to housing instability, where the intersection of professional assistance, technology innovation, and education empowerment, compassionate intervention, they bring about real change. Also joining us is Ishmael Rahimian. He is an entrepreneur, a peacemaker, an educator, certified Tai Chi instructor. I'm a big fan of the Tai Chi. Learning, teaching, and helping others succeed energizes him. And after leading his own business for over 30 years, his passion took him back to the university, where he was taught management, marketing, communication, negotiation, and conflict resolution at the Graduate School of Business for the past 27 years. With a doctorate in management, Esmail has learned the best way to help others is to pay special attention to their narrative, their interests, and be responsive rather than imposing his own narrative on them. As a peacemaker, Esmail has practiced conflict resolution for over 30 years and ADR for the last 6. Next is a friend and colleague that I'm really excited to introduce you to, Roger Moss. Roger became a professional neutral in 2013, following a career in negotiation, strategic planning, and executive leadership in commercial real estate. He is best known as a creative connector, innovator, and has served as chairman of the Association for Dispute Resolution of Northern California and is a vice chair of the Washington State Bar Association's ADR Sections Executive Committee. In 2021, he co-produced the inaugural Northwest Collaborative Futures Conference. And in addition to managing ADR programs at the Bar Association of San Francisco, Roger operates Rincon Resolutions LLC, which is a consultancy that promotes global innovation of conflict engagement. I'm so thrilled to have all of these speakers with us, but before we get them going in their presentation, I'd like to ask my moderator, Jeff Kitchaven, to tell us how we're doing for donations thus far.
Thank you, Natalie. It's always so exciting to announce the running total of contributions our generous audiences have made in honor of our great speakers. And these are just the donations of which we're aware. The running total, $269,720.20. Thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you so much to our great speakers for these wonderful presentations. Natalie, back to you.
Thanks, Jeff. So let me start with Carole, Roger, and Esmail, and I will let you all unmute yourselves. Please give us an introduction to the food banks that you would like for all of our listeners to consider, and then lead us into your program.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here today. So we, Esmail and I, are in the South Bay now, technically. And so for that reason, we wanted to nominate the Silicon Valley Food Bank and encourage anyone on this call and more broadly otherwise to participate in helping one of the richest localities in the nation, frankly, with what otherwise is food insecurity for so many. Ishmael, do you want to say a word about that too?
Great, thank you. And thanks for being here. I just echo what Carole said in terms of the donation to the local food bank where we are. And I'll pass it to Roger.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm Roger. I'm speaking to you from an island in the Puget Sound that is the traditional homeland of the Suquamish people. I'm sitting just a few minutes' drive from the grave of a great chieftain for whom Seattle takes its name. And I selected the food bank serving the Pueblo Indians and the Navajo Nation from New Mexico, the Roadrunner Food Bank. And I did it because I've had a lifelong love and affection for the landscape and the people in that area, but also because I've greatly enjoyed through this program, and thank you all for your support, and those of you that have been put it together, supporting food banks in the Bay Area, in Auckland, in various largely urban centers. It's real easy to get money to those places. And I began to check for a food bank serving the still terribly neglected Native American indigenous people. And it was extraordinary. It took me hours to find a resource that served an area the size of the state of Connecticut. And this happens to be the same area where in the United States we had the highest death rate of COVID, which tells you something about the lack of resources. I actually talked to the director of the Human Resources and Health Agency of the Navajo Nation, who said there isn't anybody inside our geography that even has a website or an email address. We have a lot of little churches and things that help, and they expect people to drop off cans of food, not send money. So they sent me to Roadrunner, who serves the entire state of New Mexico with an emphasis on the people who need the help the most. So thanks for listening to that. There's a lot operating behind the lack of resources and the plight in that area that we should be mindful of.
Thank you so much for introducing us to your food banks of choice. We are really looking forward to your program on disrupting. Tell us more, Roger.
Well, I'm going to pass to Carole, who gave me the opportunity 6 years ago to create something very different at a moment in time when the city of San Francisco decided that the homelessness issues had become such a crisis that they decided to change many things to address them. And they asked Carole, who for years has developed award-winning programs for the Bar Association of San Francisco that serve the community, to create a preventative mediation program to prevent evictions among the most vulnerable people, particularly people living in supportive housing. And so Carole, perhaps you'd like to pick up from there. And we had a number of interesting conversations in the summer of 2016 and complete setting the table, and I'll dive back in later.
Thank you, Roger. Well, that's such a gracious introduction. And I have to say, honestly, that Roger has been a thought partner in so much of this work that has made it a great success. And we just have really fun conversations, which I think have really bloomed into what we're going to kind of dive into a little bit more deeply today, which is really trying to think broadly and much differently about what the landscape of conflict navigation and dispute resolution really could be. Certainly, in the pandemic, there were many different kinds of struggles and there were many different kinds of opportunities. And one of them is in terms of the opportunity that so many of us were accelerated and forced into so much more activity online for resolving problems. And what happened in that space is that suddenly, I still remember the day when the shutdown happened and the mediators in our program at the Bar Association, some of which were, we can't do this online. We'll just have to, I don't know how to do this Zoom thing, and it's impossible to really get the full work of dispute resolution, that process handled when you can't physically be in the presence of another. And of course, that had to shift, and it shifted quite quickly. And then many of the advantages around being online in a dispute resolution process started to show up, not to mention that there certainly are some disadvantages. But what we want to kind of think about now is what it really means to think differently. What is the differently part about? And how does the role of neutrality enrich all the process, whether it's online, in person, by text, using avatars, and so on? There's so many new ways in which we can put together this process of dispute resolution. And we've had, we want to kind of dive in initially to really think about what we mean when we talk about radical neutral advocacy. This is sort of a phrase that we've been generating a bit, and we want to break that down a little bit as part of how we're going to lead you to understanding a bit the design, if you will, for dispute resolution processes that can in fact be much more durable and long lasting for people, that edge hopefully on the side of transformation, that propel forward what it means for people to truly be secure and safe in their homes and in their community. And we have a lot of different ways that we'll talk about that, but I'm going to turn it back over now a bit to Roger to lead us in the beginning of this idea here about radical neutral advocacy and its elements.
These ideas sprang from my efforts in 2012 to 2014 to pivot from a collaborative negotiation career in business to being a professional neutral. And I went back to the Bay Area, which has many nodes of thought leadership and academy and just real practical, great trainers in the mediation space. And I soaked it all up and I loved it. I wished, why didn't I find this sooner? It was a very exciting time. And I was trying to build a business. I was trying to market myself in new ways. And it was far more challenging than I expected. And I was doing everything that's recommended, networking and getting on panels. And I met Carole during that period. But there were 2 or 3 things that came together about the same period of time that deeply influenced me. The first is, and we're going to talk a lot about messaging and vocabulary and things that we developed for the conflict intervention service program that we think have application generally to our industry, to our field. And so in a private lunch in a college town called Davis, California, I had tracked down a legend in our field who has made me swear to never use his name in a forum like this that's recorded, although it may leak out eventually. But he said to me, Roger, whatever you do, don't call yourself a mediator. And I looked at him and said, tell me more. And he said, here's the secret we don't like to talk about. Most people, the consumers, the people who come to mediation to get problems resolved, don't leave feeling happy about the process. That comes from the way traditional mediation is done, which can be highly pressurized. It can be a single moment. He said, so find a different way to style yourself, and that will help. And so that idea, along with understanding as time went on that I needed to be a specialist in things I already understood to market myself, and that with real estate conflict in particular, there are many elements of it that don't lend itself to excellent resolution through traditional structured mediation, particularly when you're talking about the tenant-landlord relationship. In most cases with tenant-landlord issues, The whole point should be to get the relationship back on track and functioning, whether we're talking about residential or business rentals. But it needs to function. It needs to have, the relationship needs to produce value for both sides. So don't call yourself a mediator. The role of behavioral health issues and addiction in on conflict and group dynamics. I've been studying that for 15 or 20 years when I met Carole from my business career, and looking at that through the lens of negotiation, that came into play. And so when Carole called and said the city of San Francisco wants to do something to prevent homelessness, I said, that's great. It won't work if you try to do structured mediation. You shouldn't even call it mediation. You need to show up really fast because issues in real estate are urgent. I mean, if any of you have ever had to call a plumber, you're not looking to make an appointment 6 weeks out. You need them there in 3 hours. And so that was one idea. We established the idea of going to the conflict. And from the beginning, we built online technologies into everything we did, because we already recognized that we were all working online, whether we called it that or not, for years and years and years, especially those of us that have been negotiating exclusively by the telephone all over the country. So this idea that there were three sort of components of mediation thought or ADR thought that we put together. One was the whole idea of ombudsman's programming, confidential consultations, coaching with an individual. Second piece was workplace investigation. Third piece was looking at conflict through the lens of behavioral health. And we put all those things together, and we established a rapid response program, which means every person who needs help, who's looking for help from the Conflict Intervention Service, is guaranteed a response within 24 hours. The help requests that come in during business hours, Monday through Friday, are typically responded to within minutes and never more than an hour or two. But we call people back on Christmas Day. We call back Saturday and Sunday. We get back to people. And Ishmael, I think, will talk a little bit more about the significance of that rapid response. I want to just, before handing it off to my colleagues for a moment, I do want to talk about two things. One is the role of the landscape in conflict. When we talk about real estate conflict, we're talking about things that happened where human beings merge with the built environment. And you have to understand the built environment and the reality that it brings to, even if we're talking about relational conflict. Because if the relational conflict is about about noise disputes or activities that bother neighbors, the physical environment greatly influences what the intensity of that conflict, and also the solutions. So weaving in real world understanding of property management and leasing, tenant advocacy, it was fundamental to success in this space. Show up quick, go to the conflict, look at things, walk the landscape, and then quickly on messaging. I'll just be really specific. We banished the word intake from our program. We don't do intake. We do welcome calls. We do first contact calls. Why do I make that distinction? The people we're talking to don't know what we call it. We wanted something to remind us every time we return a call to a frightened person with a problem, that they're a human being, and our first job is to meet them with love and compassion where they are as quickly as possible. If I'm thinking about intake, if I'm thinking about the demographic information we have to collect to give to our grant funders, it's real easy to slip into, this is just a fungible widget I'm dealing with, and it's a problem, and I don't start by loving them and making sure they're okay. And so we have many examples of this vocabulary focus that will crop up in the next few minutes. We don't talk about landlords and tenants. We talk about housing providers. We talk about business owners. We talk about residents. At every opportunity, we try to slow down and humanize our language as another critical tool of de-escalation, generating empathy, and that makes solutions, which are always practical in a real estate context, so much easier to achieve. Ishmael, do you want to add to Pat at all?
Yes, thank you. Let me say that I've had the privilege of working with Carole and Roger for the past 3 years. And having the academic background, I look at this practice, and I say practice because of the martial art background. It's a continuous study for me. So when we talk about neutral advocacy, to frame it as part of advocating for the process, in this program, we can easily claim that we are outcome driven. That's actually one of the 5 components I wanted to share with you, which Roger touched on: rapid response. And why is it important for us to, when the help request comes in, for us to do that rapid response, not a rapid reaction? And I want to qualify the distinction, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, to respond to that human being who is in distress on the other end of the line, whether that's through an email or a call. And I have noticed when I have had the privilege of responding to those requests, usually less than 20 minutes, sometime within a couple minutes, there was a moment of pause initially in the first few months, which I tried to figure out what that was all about on the other end of the line. And once I asked one of the people who had called us, why did you pause when I called you? And he said, I cannot believe someone actually called me. I just called a few minutes ago. So this is just a demonstration of what we do in terms of rapid response, which is, again, 24/7, 365. So it continues on during the holidays and weekends. As Roger mentioned, we do respond to them. The other element, and we'll be glad to entertain any question later with respect to these components, is the practice of being compassion-centered. It's very easy to make a claim of being compassionate. We have a team that we work with, and it's wonderful to see our colleagues from the Conflict Intervention Service, which we'll refer to as CIS, being here with us, because it does take that team to practice compassion, to remind ourselves, to remind each other if we need to de-escalate ourselves before we go into de-escalating the situation. We can rely on our team to have a conversation wherever the help is needed. And then the team itself being interdisciplinary as a third element on this advocating for a process of what we call neutral advocacy, has to do with the team itself, which is diverse culturally, multilingual, and different set of skills. If mental support is needed in a case, with a co-facilitation model, which is the other element of the program being collaborative, that we can call on the co-facilitator with those special skills, whether it has to do with the cultural element, language element, or the element of mental support. We can get them involved and help us through the process. And of course, outcome driven, as I mentioned earlier, it is our focus. To qualify it again, as Roger mentioned, we are in the real estate vertical, more specifically tenant-landlord dispute. And of course, objective is to prevent homelessness. Therefore, it's important for us, as we advocate for a process, also to be outcome driven at the same time. So I wanted to share those elements with you, which is the core of what we do every day, and then dissect it from that point and be able to entertain your question. Also, I need to mention that Sarah will be sharing with you as well, a few PowerPoint that we put together on a PDF file that sort of outlines this thinking and our contact information if it's needed. So let me turn it to my colleagues, Carole and Roger, to see if anything they want to add to the conversation.
I'll jump in quickly and say, with regard to the PDF we'll be sharing, we're hungry to share what we do with everyone. Carole and I designed the program to be shared, to be expanded. We have definite ideas on scaling the kind of work we do for many reasons is doable. I'd like to acknowledge that Deanna Parrish has joined us, who's with the Harvard Program of Negotiation and in charge of their tech design section, and has written a masterpiece recently on the eviction diversion program operating in the United States. There's so much opportunity here to create something huge that helps people rapidly wherever they need it. And one of the interesting things about real estate is issues, particularly tenant-landlord issues, is the fundamentals were established and organized in the 12th century by Henry II. It hasn't changed much since then. And while there's small differences in rules in the United States among 50 states, the general principles of landlord-tenant, how the relationship operates, they're very practical. They've been around for ages. And so people, you don't have to be an expert in San Francisco law to do the work that we do. And the attorneys were very uncomfortable with me saying that originally, but they've gotten over it. And we have members of our team who support CIS and get paid to do it, by the way, on this call, who are international. We have people who, Gina Delamari is here from Victoria Island, one of our commercial mediators, and several other people. So it's the opportunity to share the work we do with other experts, which is a great joy to us, and they deliver incredible value. Carole?
Yeah, I thank you, Rob.
You just froze up, Carole.
Well, Roger,
can
I interrupt with a, oh, sorry, there's Carole back with us.
Sorry about that. We're having some weather conditions and it seems to interrupt it.
She may call in. Go ahead, Natalie, with your question.
Well, so I've got a procedural question, I guess. How do you get, when you're doing a rapid response, you've obviously got the tenant, the resident right there. So that's the easy part of the equation. How do you get the decision maker with the REIT or building or whatever the property is? How do you get that decision maker also present in a rapid response situation?
That's a great question in a couple of different ways. First of all, we engage in continuous grassroots marketing of our services. The first 18 months of program development was primarily in getting the word out and convincing the housing provider community, which the way property managers are trained, the way they think about it, about doing their jobs, they don't like to ask for help. Asking for help, particularly with tenant relations, is very difficult for them. But as we made little breakthroughs with people that understood that we were not trying to replace anybody, that includes the lawyers, the tenant advocates, we are value add. When senior managers started to see how we could come in and relieve pressure on their teams and come in and out quickly and reset the table, they started to see the value. So a continuous dialogue with housing providers, the tenant advocate community, with social service groups. We're now everywhere in the Bay Area, the CIS program, where we show up on everybody's websites. A lot of people know us, but we still do this outreach work because of the huge turnover in these companies. There's always somebody who doesn't know about us. We also focused on early intervention. And originally, when we started the program, we thought we'd be doing a lot of work at the courts, but I'm sorry, those of you associated with courts, the courts have not been friendly until recently. With COVID under pressure, courts in the city of San Francisco have just been a little behind the curve compared to other courts in other places, particularly with technology issues. Scott Gearing is with us. He's the head of our court program at CIS. And so we knew that the earlier we get involved with conflict and disputes, the easier they are to settle. And the city wanted us to create a preventative maintenance approach, which is what we did. So we're really teaching people how to do the tenant-landlord relationship. And to come back directly to your question, Natalie, there are now now we have direct relationships with many major housing providers, with organizations that serve housing providers. And for the first couple of years, most of our cases were coming from them, those who got it, those who embraced our services. It was only really during COVID when a lot of different kinds of things happened that created crises, that probably now most of the calls we get are from the resident side or the small business side, because we're doing commercial work now, than the landlord side. But pretty much everyone is aware of us, and we constantly sustain carrying that message. I mean, Carole, did I miss something there? And Natalie, did I answer your question?
Let me quickly add to what Roger said, which is a relationship with attorneys in the city as well. Throughout the year, we have established those relationships, we maintain those relationships. In cases where landlords are represented by an attorney, we do reach out to the attorneys, and most of them understand mediation and advocate for that process actually themselves. A question, Roger, Carole, popped up in the chat just quickly about how's the program funded. And before I turn it to Carole for the funding part of it, I would like to add that our program is successful also because our mediators are paid. So that is a big component of what we do. I just want to touch on that. We can talk about it more later. It is wonderful to have the volunteer panels for us to be able to do that rapid response, to be compassion centered, as I mentioned earlier, and to be able to provide that service. The mediators, the facilitators out there, the conflict navigators, let's say, are paid actually. So on the question of funding, Carole, if you would address that.
I apologize, my connectivity is so bad today. Quickly, the Conflict Intervention Service is funded by the City and County of San Francisco, and one of the ways city itself also is investing in a program like mediation through the Bar Association CIS to prevent and create prevent housing instability and create a mechanism by which agreements and disruptions in the relationship between housing providers and residents, in fact, can stay on track. Because one of the elements I want to bring out here in the thinking of it, and I'll get back to why we pay the mediators and why a paid structure for the mediators doing the work is essential, frankly, and important, obviously. But is that we also have an element of what we call aftercare. So when we come into this process and we build an interdisciplinary model inside it, so we say to somebody who's having a cognitive behavioral condition that's also part of the disruption, and we come in with that compassion through people who are, I know on this call we have our wonderful blend of a person who has 20 years of psychiatric.
Carole's breaking up. She was introducing Rebecca Sparks, who's with us, who's a psychiatric nurse and a mediator for 30 years. I put in the chat the emphasis we have on doing trainings and workshops, which is a development tool, a case development tool. Every time we do a training for a housing provider, we just did 2 trainings in de-escalation and when to call a neutral, when not to do it yourself. We're one of the world's largest housing providers in their San Francisco office. And within 3 weeks, we had 50 cases emerge from 2 or 3 other communities in San Francisco. We constantly need to go back and remind people of the utility of these very nimble resources. And that's part of what's attractive to what we do. When people understand, and many of the people that we've dealt with, an executive director of a housing provider in Seattle once said to me when I asked whether they had tried any kind of ADR to help with tenant relations, her response without missing a beat was, God knows we need help, Roger. I can't afford to send my people up to the Dispute Resolution Center for 3 hours of reflective listening practice. I almost fell over in my chair. But then I remembered I was a real estate problem solver for 30 years. And it wasn't about the processes that we all learn and love. There's nothing wrong with them. It's how do we deploy them that's differently for the context. You know, how do we, and these housing providers, they need help quickly. They need solutions quickly. The other thing we haven't mentioned, this is a keystone when we started. Our program could not be a tenant advocacy program in disguise. I said to Carole, we have to love the property managers and respect them, and they have an equal place at the table. It can't be San Francisco ideology about the splits between landlords and tenants. And you know, property management is an incredibly challenging job, and many of these folks are traumatized by the experiences they have in property management, especially in supportive housing. So this whole compassion-centered thing is very real for us and critical to getting practical results. What's a good practical result? Before COVID, we had a 97.1% positive settlement rate in our cases, with over 1,000 cases at that point in which no one lost their home, even though sometimes people need to move. That's another story. I'm going to stop there for a moment. We have a lot of people that work in our space. I see Chelsea Kaplan with the San Francisco Community Boards. Thank you for being here. Please speak up, dive in, ask questions.
Roger, there's a question on the chat, which is, what is the alternate term to mediation that you favor? Would you speak to that, please?
Sure, I'll resist the question, how much time do you have? But we came up with conflict intervention for our program in San Francisco, and the city liked it. And the idea was we wanted words that showed the urgency about what we do. I mean, sometimes I call myself a facilitator. I most often hear myself when people ask me, what do you do for a living? I say professional neutral. Nobody knows what that is, but I say that. But the conflict intervention service, that was very carefully put together to show the sense of urgency, the fact that we are intervening and that we're coming with solutions, that we know how to get the heart started again, and that we don't lay back and wait for other people. You know, we shine a light on the realm of possibilities. And while I think the ideas that we're using have general application to many kinds of disputes, I will also say, I'm one who will tell you, real estate dispute resolution, the real estate business ain't rocket science, okay? And it's very practically oriented. And you can have the complex disputes are usually when you have a bunch of people who are fighting, often tenant residents fighting among each other and facing, sometimes with behavioral health issues, and a bunch of people are facing eviction because they're disrupting a community. And we do traditional restorative circle work to deal with traumatized communities and get people calmed down. And then we can talk to them about the problems they have with their living environments, which are sometimes pretty tough. So we have some of these things we're doing that take months to do and that you all would recognize. But the more fluid things, you know, the questions are, is the roof leaking or not? Is the tenant paying the rent or not? If not, you know, are they spending their money on whiskey, or did they have a financial calamity last month and they can't pay the rent? Because the answers to those questions create two very different pathways. But by understanding how the real estate business works and how the tenant-landlord relationship should work, it greatly accelerates the pathway to solution, which is critical for the repeat use by the big housing providers. They understand we get it, and we get their issues. Ishmael, did I answer the question remotely?
I believe so. If not, please let us know in the chat if there's anything more specifically we need to address. Also, let me add that about over a year ago, we started the program for merchant as well. This had to do with COVID. The business has been shut down either temporarily or for a period of time. The tenants, some of them were not able to make their rents in a timely manner. And again, the program is funded by the Office of Economic and Workforce Development in San Francisco, which aids the merchants of the city. And that service again is available to both tenant and landlord at no charge. So I just wanted to add that that's another program that we had started over a year ago, and it'll continue to this day.
Well, and I'll just jump in to say too that the same kinds of issues propagate, whether it's a merchant or a resident in low-income housing, in that there are those modalities where the threat is frankly quite enormous. You either are faced with the loss of income if you're a merchant or commercial tenant potentially, or loss of home. So these are very personal and very compassion-oriented kinds of moments for people in their lives. And I just wanted to emphasize the gravitas, frankly, of we treat these things often as transactions between people doing business around things like income and home. So let's just, remind ourselves what it really means to be operating in dispute resolution, in a process, in the real estate landscape. I just wanted to bring that up.
And in the meantime, we have one more question in the chat. If I may, it asks, is there any role that a conflict management coaching plays in your ADR services? Is there a role
Yes,
that
and I would add
coaching?
there's no tool in the big, beautiful universe of dispute resolution that we hesitate to pick up. We embrace all of it. Conflict coaching, we have a number of conflict coaches that are on our team. And so, yes. And this gets to the bigger theme. Why are we talking about, and it may sound arrogant to some of you, and forgive me if it does, that's not the intention. We're talking about what we do, how we do it, being this gateway to 21st century access to justice. And now I'm going to quote Colin Rule, all right, without telegraphing at all that he might be that person that told me that secret thing when I started as a professional neutral. Colin Rule has said, and often says in recorded environments, that the consumers have voted against the justice system through the internet. What does he mean by that? People need help quickly. They need help to be affordable. They want to know what it costs in advance. So all these small things that are actually big things that we talk about in the ADR space. Are you still quoting hourly rates, or are you talking about fixed fees? Are you still arguing about Zoom? COVID seemed to have fixed that problem, where people who said they would never do virtual conferencing are now embracing it, including my chief mentor, Steve Rosenberg in Marin County, who's 100% Zoom now. But the whole paradigm has shifted away from particularly the American justice system, which doesn't work. What else is wrong with it? In my view, and this is my love of language, when people talk about justice in the United States, they're thinking retribution. They're thinking about hitting back. They're thinking adversarial and attack. Everything that's going on in the world right now is just on fire with that stuff. We're the only antidote out there, and some great religions perhaps who offer any other kind of thinking. And so we know how well collaborative negotiation and compassion-centered thinking works on a one-on-one level and with big issues. There are many examples of that beyond our program. So let's start talking about that being the solution. That's the big shift that we see is possible looking forward. Carole, Ishmael, or anyone else?
Questions are coming in, and want to make sure that we do address them. The question asked, the three question, one has two parts that says, are you paid mediator also attorneys? How do you avoid giving legal advice? The answer is yes. Independent contractors are attorneys. How do we avoid giving legal advice? We just constantly remind each other, remind ourselves, remind our colleagues. And when we facilitate discussion, we do qualify that we do not provide legal advice. Roger, Carole, do you have anything to add to those two questions?
Well,
there are one more question in there too.
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump in to say, I think one of the powerful models we've been speaking of is appropriating all the many modalities for dispute resolution and amalgamating them and adjusting them for context, right? And similarly, the hybrid model of legal and dispute resolution can be very powerful. So we have, for example, a 2-hour legal consultation that's available, again, paid for through the consult, so that if there is a pressing legal answer needed and or a lease review or something that's going to help set the table for that person, not a party, but a person to come to the table, then we flip it over to, for that purpose, for that consultation, then come back. You know, that's the idea. So just want to say that that's the other way to think about it too, is you don't have to leave it as, sorry, my role is only this, but rather let's be inclusive of legal for its purposes, but in reverse order, to aid dispute resolution, not the other way around, not to aid a legal process for settlement. Or, I mean, of course, that's good. What I'm trying to get at is, you know, let's bring the legal in where needed in parts and pieces, but it's not the process. Dispute resolution is the process.
Yeah, and this brings me back to real estate is not rocket science. So I was hired right out of law school by a big retailer that many of you will remember called the Woolworth Company into their real estate department. And they were very careful to tell me, for historic reasons, we like to hire young people out of law school. You have certain skills. You know absolutely nothing to do the job we've hired you to do. We're going to teach you. And you'll be working with the lawyers, but you're a real estate person, not part of the legal department. And the idea here is the law isn't terribly helpful except in identifying sort of certain boundaries. And either are leases, frankly. The law and leases are important guideposts to doing the tenant-landlord relationship. This is the philosophy that I know is behind the successful operation of real estate, to generate profit for investors and to provide homes and places for people to do business. So yes, there is something called the Doctrine of Habitability that says you have to have a water heater and a working kitchen and a roof that doesn't leak if you're going to rent out a house. Otherwise, it's an illegal dwelling. We need laws like that. Every state in the United States and in other jurisdictions has them. But the law doesn't fix the roof. Okay, so there are sometimes ambiguities in leases, particularly commercial leases, about who's responsible to do what. And I could get real granular about this, but I won't. The point is, the quicker we can get away from arguing about the law and get the damn roof fixed, or get the tenant rental assistance to pay the rent that the lease obligates them to pay, that's where the real solution is. And if there's something operating that gets in the way of a practical solution, that will manifest in a confidential process. It will be the tenant who is facing eviction, because this is a true story, and we can send you articles that are chock full of examples of this. There was an elderly woman facing eviction because she could no longer take her dog out to the backyard in the city of San Francisco to pee, and she was letting the dog walk down the stairs into the basement and come back on his own and do his business in the basement. And the landlord had just renovated the building, and no one understood why this had happened. The woman and the dog had lived there for years. Why is she suddenly using the common areas of the building as a potty for the dog? The answer, which we only learned because we sent our mediator to visit with this woman at her home and to look around and ask questions. And she was a therapist, and we sent somebody who was a deeply compassionate man and a master trainer named Donald Proby. Many of you know him. And he discovered she had broke her lease and rented out her bedroom to a subtenant. And she could have faced eviction the way that unfolded. But mostly she was just scared of the landlord. And this gets to Gene's reference to slumlords. This is where the ideology and the stigma-laden language is not helpful. Our therapist, 90-year-old therapist with her dog, was certain that the landlord just wanted to get rid of her so he could rent her space out at market rates. That was false. And he didn't care about the subtenant once she allowed us to disclose it. And when he found out what was really going on, and Donald Proby had noticed that a window in her kitchen could be converted, or a glass window could have some steps installed into it so the dog could get out in the private backyard again, the landlord spent $500 and made it happen. And everyone was happy. And by God, the new landlord who bought this little building on Russian Hill and the tenant were very close in age. They were both, second generation immigrants in San Francisco, and they gave each other a hug at the end. They really did. They wept. And the landlord said, I'm making all the money I need off this building from these 2 units that were empty when I bought it. I want you to stay here forever. So that result would not have happened had we not shown up in person, on site, asked questions. It also started, by the way, because the landlord's attorney, who was vilified for being one of the most ferocious landlord attorneys in the city of San Francisco, knew me personally and knew about the CIS program. He suggested to the tenant's lawyer, she was represented by lawyers' assistants for the elderly in San Francisco. The landlord sent the tenant's lawyer to us. So this is fundamental change that we're talking about here. Slumlords. Yes, there are some, not as many as we think, just as there's not as many deadbeat tenants as we think. Mary Hennessy is with us, who spent her life delivering affordable housing to people in California. And there are operators of properties, Gene, in the Tenderloin. And there's a few bad actors, no question about that. But there's a long, complicated history about affordable housing in San Francisco. And there are nonprofits that are amazing human beings, and they live to provide people homes, and they're being given buildings by the city of San Francisco that were neglected for 50 years, and they're disaster areas with traumatized locations, and there's massive problems while the landlords are trying to fix the place up. You want to see horror, first you make people live, marginalized people live in a building for 50 years that's never been maintained, and then somebody comes in and tries to fix it up. And if you're 80 years old and you're in a wheelchair on the 4th floor and you've just been told there's not going to be an elevator for 6 months, that's a problem. And everybody's terrified of everybody else. And so these are very complex situations. And our organization organically comes in and gets people stabilized so they're not killing each other one day at a time, so things can be incrementally improved for the community. And sometimes that takes years. I'm going to stop there now.
Another question came in with respect to language and the role of multilingual in the process and the impact that has on our program and the success of the facilitation that we do. Carole, do you want to
Well,
talk to that a
I
little
know
bit?
we have Patricia Draves on the call here today. Hello, Patricia, and others who are bilingual. And I know we've had any number of instances in the conflict intervention service where we want to remove that barrier. We want to have not only linguistic but cultural understanding, and as well as trauma-informed practices. And there was a moment in the program we had a trilingual mediation, we'll call it that for now, where it was Chinese speaking landlord, if I remember correctly, and a Spanish speaking tenant. I can't underscore enough how critical, as we all know, if your first exercise is to develop a compassion response and empathy around what it means to have a struggle linguistically, culturally in a land that's not your homeland, and yet have your home be at risk, and engaging in a process to be able to trust who you're engaging with and trust a process, manifesting that interpretation and interpreter who can show up and interface and translate and be suddenly the whole shift happens where somebody can already be put at ease. So I just can't emphasize enough how important it is to remove those the linguistic and cultural barriers that may be operating in the background, and the number of stereotypes, right, that go along with working with people from different countries and places in the world. So we in the Conflict Intervention Service contracted with services to be able to find interpreters when needed in many different kinds of languages, but certainly also striving on staff to have the representative languages in the populations we're serving the most. And in San Francisco, that's certainly the Chinese-speaking community and Spanish-speaking community. But yeah, that's just a little bit of word around that. That's the first entry into de-escalation.
And I will add, practical results from having access to all these different proficiencies. So Gina has been involved heavily in our commercial program. As she put in the chat, I think her background is an incredible negotiation career involving First Nations people and governments and private parties in British Columbia. But she also has background. Most everybody with our program have very real world background with commercial or residential real estate, understand both from a tenant or a landlord side. And there were a number of businesses that were closed or going to close their businesses in San Francisco when we started working in the commercial space. These were primarily immigrant families. They were new to San Francisco. They started a business. They were doing well before COVID. They got clobbered by COVID, and they made the decision to close prematurely. And we, with Gina's intervention and business analysis, she was able to show these business owners how they could restructure things to move forward and reopen their business. And then she went and made the deal with a landlord to sustain it. And this is very important for preserving the unique neighborhoods in San Francisco with these legacy businesses. And they would not have survived without this very different kind of intervention we provide. My colleagues are pinging me that we're almost out of time. So I'm going to thank you all and stop talking.
Well, let me on behalf of Natalie and Jeff and and everybody who's here today, thank you so much, Esmail, Carole, and Roger. You're doing amazing work, and it's clearly making a difference in the lives of so many. Truly a wonderful thing to see and hear about. And thank you to everybody else on this Zoom who's involved in the programs, who've had a chance to speak up. I know that the food banks that the speakers mentioned in the very beginning would be so grateful for any donations you might be able to give. The Second Harvest of Silicon Valley, and then the Roadrunner Food Bank. The websites are in the chat. They're the very first item. You can scroll back up to that. And whether you can give anything or not, thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for the wonderful work you do. It's just fantastic. So appreciated. Okay.
And thank you so much for giving us the opportunity today.
Yeah,
thank you.
Great. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Absolutely. Jeff, would you like to close us out?
Thank you all. The wonderful presentation. We hope people are able to support the food banks in your honor. And we'll see you next week, everybody. With that, we are complete.